Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. Welcome to today's Fireside Chat. No passing here for Latinx artists on theater and race ethnicity. My name is Alex Santiago Hirao. I'm the Director of Education at New York Theater Workshop, he, him, his, or él, if you're speaking Spanish. And we are broadcasting from Zoom and simultaneously streaming on YouTube. So you can join us that way as well. And we're happy to have you all here today. New York Theater Workshop has long sought to create art that interrogates our past as a way of understanding the present and shining light toward the future. And to that end, we are taking the time to recognize the history of the land we occupy in the East Village. And as we find ourselves in the digital space, we'd like to embrace this opportunity to acknowledge the many native lands from which we are all tuning in today. We are posting a link in the chat where you can learn about the tribal history of the land on which you are situated. And we invite everyone to take a moment and input your address into the website and post in the chat the native land from which you're joining us today. Manhattan has always been a gathering and trading place for many indigenous peoples, where nations intersected from all four directions since time immemorial. And it was a place to gather and sometimes to seek refuge during times of conflict and struggle. And we pay respect to all of their ancestors, past, present, and to their future generations. And we acknowledge that New York Theater Workshop is situated on the island of Manhattan, Manhattan on the island, traditional lands of the Munsee Lenape, the Canarsie, the Unkachak, the Tenoch, Shinnecock, Rickawank, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We respect that many indigenous people continue to live and work on this island, and we acknowledge their ongoing contributions to the area. We would like to thank Safe Harbors NYC for their collaboration and contributions to this land acknowledgement. This panel this afternoon is part of NYTW's virtual programming series, which is all free and available to the entire NYTW community. If you are in the position to do so, we hope you would join us and consider donating in honor of this conversation to All Go and also to NYTW to support ongoing programming. All Go celebrates and nurtures vibrant queer people of color communities in Texas and beyond, and they do this through cultural arts, wellness, and social justice programming by supporting artists and artistic expression within their diverse immigrant communities as well, promoting health within a wellness model and mobilizing and building coalitions among marginalized groups by race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and sexual identity in order to enact change. So you will see more information about them at the end of the conversation with links to where you can donate. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Victor I. Cazares, who is our playwright in residence at NYTW, who will be moderating this conversation. Victor.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Take it
Hi.
away.
Hi, my name is Victor I. Cazares, and I don't have an agenda. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Tao playwright in residence at New York Theater Workshop. This conversation will last around an hour, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A for the last 15 minutes. When we get to the Q&A portion, feel free to share your questions for the panelists via the Q&A feature on Zoom or comments on Facebook Live, or YouTube, actually. We'll do our best to get to as many questions that we can in the time that we have. And now I'd like to introduce my guests. First is Virginia Grise, or Vicky Grise, writes plays that are set in bars without windows, barrio rooftops, and lesbian bedrooms. Her published work includes Your Healing is Killing Me, Blue, The Panza Monologues, co-written with Irma Mayorga, and an edited volume of Zapatista Comuniques titled Conversations with Don Durito. Virginia is a recipient of the Yale Drama Award, Whiting Writers Award, and the Princess Grace Award in theater directing, and the Jerome Fellowship from the Playwright Center. Virginia has taught writing for performance at the university level as a public school teacher, in community centers, women's prisons, and in the juvenile correction system. She holds an MFA in writing for performance from the California Institute of the Arts and is the Mellon Foundation playwright and is the Mellon Foundation Playwright in Residence at Cara Mia Theater in Dallas, Texas. Andrew G. Rodriguez is an actor and director originally from Mirando City, Texas. His artistic mission is to create new, thrilling, and uncompromising theater that tells the untold stories of underrepresented voices, perspectives, and experiences. In 2019, Andrew graduated with his BFA in theater studies from the University of Texas at Austin. He recently completed an acting apprenticeship at Actors Theater of Louisville as a member of the 2019-2020 professional training company. Andrew is currently based in New York and works at the Juilliard School Drama Division. Hi, Andrew. Lindsay Rico is a multidisciplinary artist based in Brooklyn, New York. She was most recently featured in Tefana's Fefu and Her Friends, directed by Liliana Blaine Cruz, and the radio play series This Is Where We Go, directed by Tamila Woodard. Next up for her is Baltimore Center Stage for the world premiere of A Play for the Living in a Time of Extinction, Miranda Rose Hall's meta one-woman show on climate change and the myth of death in isolation, directed by Tavy Magar. Welcome, Lindsay. And Tiffany Small is a professional New York City actress and a graduate of Columbia University's acting MFA program. Past credits include In Her View, Juliet Gallops Apace, Into the Zone, Julius Caesar, Mad Forest. Que Dios te bendiga, she says. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today in what I imagine to be Univision's worst nightmare. And if you can all we can all unmute our mics. I wanted to create a space where we could have a conversation on race without being interrupted by white, Latino, Latina fragility, or being called divisive. So thank you so much for joining me. And first, I want to start first by asking how you first took it upon yourself to become an artist. Just an open-ended question like that. Tiffany, yeah.
So I kind of got my start in the arts because my mother decided when I was very young that I was going to go to school, but she wasn't going to pay for it. Right. So she kind of just like threw me into everything, dance, theater, literally anything in every after school program that she could get me into, I was a part of. And I kind of just like took to acting. So yeah, I am also a multiple disciplinary artist, but like acting was kind of like what called to me the most. And now I'm here.
Yay. Thank you. What about you, Lindsay?
I think that similarly to Tiffany, at first it was just like an effort to like, get me out of the house, get me into school. If I learn a few things along the way, like great. But I think that for the most part, like my parents instilled like a great appreciation for art. I think that they're both very creative people. But it wasn't until I think college that I really used it as something as a form of self-expression. It wasn't until college when it actually clicked for me. And that had a lot to do with other people being so like rooted in their identity as artists, coming into contact with brown and Black people who already just like were so sure. So, yeah.
Thank you. Virginia, what about you?
I also just wanted to say that my last name's Grace.
Oh, sorry.
It's not Grise in any context. Just wanted to make that clarification before you throw up any Whopper Mercado slides today. So I actually became an artist. I tell this story often because of Sharon Bridgeforth. I call her my art paw. And she sort of grabbed me by the hair, kicking and screaming, and we had a very long relationship of taking writing workshops together. She was facilitating, I was taking the workshops. And that happened because I was a high school teacher doing work in the Juvenile Detention Center in Austin, Texas, with Raul Salinas, who was a poet who owned a small bookstore in Austin called Resistencia that still exists. And Sharon heard me read a poem as part of that workshop because I was working with somebody who couldn't read and write. And so I was transcribing what he was writing so that he could perform at the end of the workshop series. And he would go into his cell, memorize it, come back. We'd keep working so that he was ready to present. And the night before we were about to present, he said, well, what about you? What are you going to read tomorrow? So I had to go home and write a poem for the first time. So I came back and presented it, and she picked me up. And I feel like early on, I had an incredible network of Black women and Chicano poets that really supported my work. And so Sharon Bridgeforth, Omi Oshun had a series called the Austin Project that was designed for artists, scholars, and organizers to come together over, again, several years. It was a 3-year process of several years of writing together, thinking together, dancing together, making work together. And that sort of introduced me into an orbit of artists that continue to influence my work and take care of me in all sorts of ways to this day.
So thank you. What about you, Andrew?
I grew up in like a really small rural town. So at my high school, there were no theater classes in the school, but we like would put on a play every year, and it would like compete as like part of this like UIL competition. And so
UIL.
at the school, you kind of did, yeah, UIL. You kind of like did everything. You did sports and you were like in the plays and all that stuff. So I was in the plays. And that's how I first was introduced to theater. So I went into college really without any like formal training, but it was in Austin, Texas, where I met so many wonderful artists, theater companies, collaborators within UT and also within the Austin community who really like taught me so much about theater. So it was like my own non-theater background meant that I had this unique opportunity to forge my own understanding of how to create work and thrive as like a generative artist creating new work. So that was how I identified and started working as an artist.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Again, I'm really excited to have every one of you here to talk about Latino-ness, Latinidad, Latin, Hispanic, like race and ethnicity, and just identity formation and our place within the art world, or not. And it's hard because like I don't know how to ask this delicately, but how do you feel about calling yourself Latino? What do you call yourself, and how did you come to identify racially, and how does it impact the way you see yourself? It's a long question. Answer it as you will. I ask in word clouds. You can also respond in word clouds. Don't make me call on you. Tiffany.
I knew that was going to happen. I have a very complicated relationship with how I identify. Well, I don't know that complicated is the right word, because I've always known who I am and who I identify as culturally, but it's sort of how the world views me that gets very complicated, right? So my mother is Puerto Rican. She's from Puerto Rico. My dad's side of the family is from Panama. And so I always grew up knowing that, right? I always grew up knowing that I was Hispanic and that I have, family that lives in Panama and I have family that lives in Puerto Rico, right? And Spanish was my mother's first language. She had to learn how to speak English. She moved to New York when she was like 6 years old and, had to learn English while also completing the first grade. So I've always known that that part of me existed, right? But I also know what I look like and how I present to the world, and how the world views me. And my mother has always been very, very upfront and open and honest about our family's heritage, right? Like we are obviously descendants of Africans, right? Like that's what I am. That's what I is. And so it's really interesting though, because whenever I would tell people that, I identify as both a Black woman and as a Hispanic woman, I always get, that's interesting because you don't look Spanish, right? Or, you don't speak Spanish fluently, or, your last name is not Rodriguez, or you whatever. And so it's always turns into this sort of long drawn out explanation of who I am and why I am. And so I remember, like kind of in like middle school and high school, I just kind of stopped telling people that, right? Like I just stopped because I got tired of explaining it. And it wasn't until I got into college and just became older and like kind of more grounded and rooted in who I was and who I wanted to be that I started taking more ownership of who I am and who I identify as, which is still complicated because, I still have people who question that, right? And part of that is because of, with the entertainment industry specifically, you usually only see one type of Hispanic person, right? You see Jennifer Lopez and you see Gina Rodriguez and you see, Antonio Banderas, and those are the people that you grow up thinking are Spanish. So if you don't look like them, then you must not be that, right? So it's still like a little complicated kind of, I have to fight with people to like audition for those roles when I know I can play them because culturally that's who I am. That's how I grew up. I grew up in a very Hispanic household, like we didn't eat a lot of the foods that I would eat when I went to school, like what is meatloaf? I don't know. I had to learn that in school, and I grew up eating arroz con gandules and maduros, and I don't know. It's so weird. It's such a weird space to be in when you know who you are, how you grew up, and your family and ancestral history, and you have other people kind of challenge you on that and tell you, no, you're not that, you're this. So yeah, it's a very complicated history of that, but I definitely now, especially now, and especially with the people that I've sort of surround myself with now, who tell me like, no, you take up the space that you are in, and you own who you are, regardless of how the world sees you, regardless of how people kind of try to make you feel. And I'm better about it now, but again, I still like experience a lot of like pushback and backlash with that, and it gets exhausting. So I kind of pick and choose my battles at this point, because what else can you do?
Yeah, it's exhausting.
It is exhausting. I be tired, y'all.
Thank you so much for sharing. Lindsay.
Honestly, I identify as a brown person. Like, I think that, like, I've edited a lot. I mean, this question is like really taking me back, because like I've edited this so many times. Really just trying to get it right for myself. And yeah, I guess brown still, I mean, I'm brown and proud, but like it still feels kind of like settling sometimes. And today, yeah, I guess like brown. I think that sometimes it's Latinx, Latinx. Sometimes it's Chicanx, and I'm still yeah, I'm still trying to understand like where I fit in that narrative and where my family fits in that narrative. Because my father's a first generation Chicano, like Mexican, or no, he's second generation. I'm first generation on my mother's side. My mother's from Thailand, and so she immigrated here in the 70s, and so I think that something that they both sort of like have in common is like this feeling of displacement, a bit. And yeah, I mean, I think I get pushed back on my identity in like strange ways too. Though, like, and I'm from Los Angeles, like it's really not uncommon there, especially now, to see, someone, Latinx with someone who, is Asian. So yeah, I guess, but today I'm just brown.
Thank you. I'm really moved by the word you use, editing, that you've edited this answer, and that like you've been doing it for years. Like that it's a
the context is important.
Yeah,
the
that it's constant
is
refinement.
so important.
Yeah.
It's becoming more and more important. And I think about the people who have asked me this question in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know, lot to think about.
Thank you. Virginia, what about you?
Well, I'm the daughter of a Chinese Mexican immigrant and a working class white father. And I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. And it's important to mention because San Antonio has 60%, it's a Mexican American majority city, over 60% Latinx, majority of that Mexican American. And so in terms of, I think this question is interesting because people have addressed both how they identify themselves and how other people identify them. And I think that what's true in the United States is that we are often only allowed one narrative, and we often only think of race in a binary. And so, I think how people perceive us shifts and changes, as Lindsay was talking about context, shifts and changes based on context. And I feel most recently, once Latinx sort of came into circulation as a terminology, as a way in which people were self-identifying, was something that did feel like a little bit of an itchy coat on me, and so anytime I use the X, I tend to say Latino, OH, AH, and all my X's, EXXX, and so, but what I've noticed is that since Latinx has been sort of in circulation, I have asked the question more of who are your people? Where are you from? Where did you grow up? Where's your mom from? Where's your dad from? I've started to ask those questions a lot more and have started to identify not only myself, but other people in that way, increasingly, which that to me is new. And I think it had to do with how, in terms of self-identification, it wasn't something that fit on me very easily. It wasn't a coat that I wore easily.
Did it start, your context was San Antonio, right? And like you've since been in California and New York and Arizona as well. Did the geography of it also affect like how you were thinking about it?
I think the geography affect how I understood race and ethnicity, which are two separate things. And I think that I learned new things. I don't necessarily know if it changed my own identity formation. For me, I feel like that has I don't know if it changed, how I identified myself, I guess I would say. And certainly in different contexts, things feel very differently. So I grew up in San Antonio. I came to Austin. Austin was sort of the first time that I realized, like, I say this often in terms of theater and theater making, I am rarely the only person of color in the room. Very rarely am I the only person of color in the room. I'm from Texas. I know what that gets you. So when I moved to Austin, it was the first time that I realized, like, I would be at a restaurant and I would have to leave. I would be like, oh, I don't, I want to leave, and I was a kid. I was, 17, 18 years old. And I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to leave. And finally, a friend of mine pointed out, they were like, oh, you can't be in the room when it's majority white people. And I was like, oh, I have never had that experience before. Like, that's not my experience. Like, Texas, San Antonio is a brown city. It is a brown city. And the ways in which people identified were you were white or you were not white. Like those were kind of the markers and the identifiers. So in terms of ethnicity, it's like you were either white or you were not white. Like, and that's the ways in which people were minoritized and the ways in which people were racialized. And that's, and so people that were able chose to pass if they could, or people chose not to pass if they, if they had that choice. And then there were people that couldn't pass, right? And so I think about my mother, who is a Chinese Mexican immigrant, and my mother's dream for all of us, I grew up in Texas, again, where Texas, everybody talks about how the border didn't cross us, we crossed it. All right, we didn't cross the border crossed us. There we go. We didn't cross the border crossed us. Well, not my mom. My mom crossed the border. And she did so by marrying a white man. And my mother actually experiences class descension as opposed to ascension in crossing that border. And so my mother, who grew up in a middle-class merchant family, married a working class white man and experienced class descension. And so my mother's desire was always that we have, that we have class ascension, that we become middle class, and I think the thing that my mother didn't understand is that when you talked about assimilation in that context, in that era, during that time, that would mean negating my mother's indigenousness, negating my mother's Chineseness. It would be negating language. It would be negating the fact that we cross that border every weekend. It would be, there's all sorts of negation that would have to happen of her. Whereas my father was very clear, y'all are Mexican. He was very clear about it. He was like, you are no longer whites, and it wasn't like, a lot of people use this language now of like, oh, I'm half this or I'm half that. And my father was like, at this point, there's been a rupture in the whiteness, and I think that some of that has to do with also what risks my father took in marrying my mother. We had no relationship to my father's side of the family, because my father left that side of the family. And so that we didn't grow up with my grandparents on my father's side. We didn't grow up with that sort of lineage being part of our upbringing. And so I think that there's also, I wouldn't ever say that my dad committed race suicide, because he didn't. There was he was not capable of doing that. But he was always very clear what it meant to be a white man in Texas, and that we were not white men in Texas.
And white men in Texas, like that's a separate talk. But thank you so much. Andrew, what about you?
Yeah, Lindsay, I totally feel you on this idea of like editing and constantly evolving. I usually just say I'm brown. My family is from South Texas. Grew up on the border, and I think it's because like in the U.S. our bodies are racialized. People racialize us. People identify a race for us and then treat us based on how they think they should treat us. And a lot of the like spaces that I worked in or rooms that I've been in have been predominantly white. And so I always lead with that, like, yeah, I'm brown. My family is in Miranda City, Texas. They've had a Mexican restaurant open for about, gosh, I think it's around 70 years now. And so my family's like, yeah, we're Mexican. But yeah, it's that idea of constantly editing and that people will decide for you. Like even just last month, I remember I was in a headshot session and they were like, oh, I see you're Mexican, but like, what else do you have? Like, there's something else there. And I'm like, okay. So I'm always reminded that here our bodies are racialized.
Thank you. Yes, racialized here, but it's also in Mexico, right? Like race is like, it is not, white supremacy did not just happen in the US.
Right.
It happened, it happened every place that it went through colonization, right? And I think like so much of, I don't know, but so much of the project of white supremacy is also erasing itself, or like erasing like the underpinning of it, which is like, I think one of the reasons why people want to like either willfully ignore, I think there's willful ignorance, but also like don't know the history of Blackness in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and the fact that enslaved people were all over these two continents. I wanted to ask Tiffany, just because we were talking about cities and the geography of cities. You grew up in Atlanta, right?
I grew up between Atlanta and New York, yeah.
And I wanted to ask about sort of like along with Vicky's answer about like San Antonio being like a racialized like city, like where like race is very like you either 60%, right? You said 60% Mexican.
Over. When I was there, it was 68.
68.
It's shifting a little bit, but when I was there, it was 68.
And I guess like how you negotiate if your identity changed, or like if you had to do more work in Atlanta, or if you had to do more work in New York, how did that manifest for you?
Oh, definitely. You know, Georgia, and I love Georgia, but Georgia, like, you know, most other cities, you're either white or not white, right? Or, you know, people would look at me and you're Black, right? And I'm like, yes, but, you know, I'm also, or my mom is actually, so that obviously that became like that's where like my complications sort of like, where all of that friction sort of started for me, because nobody questions anything in New York City, right? Because you've got Dominicans, you've got Cubans, you've got Italians, you've got, you know, like there's so much representation that you can kind of just tell people who you are, where you're from, or whatever, and they will just be like, oh yeah, you know, like, yep, that makes sense, or sure, okay, whatever, right? But in Georgia, and especially because it's a much more racial space, right? And there's so much more racial tension down there. You know, people, who you are becomes incredibly important, right? Like, I went to high school with a young lady who, her father is Dominican, her mother was white, and, you know, given the racial history of where I went to high school, she would tell people that she was Dominican and white, right? But you would look at her and you would know that her Dominican ancestry was obviously, she was Afro-Latina, right? But I'm Dominican and I'm white. She would get very, you know, upset or give such incredible pushback whenever someone would assume that she was Black or, you know, whatever. And, you know, at first I was like angry about it, right? Because I'm just like, girl, who you kidding? Like, we know where your ancestors came from. They came from the same place that mine did. Stop playing, right? But then at the same time, it's like, can I blame her though? Knowing the racial history, and to sort of put it in context, the area that I grew up and went to high school with in Georgia, when I showed up in 9th grade, there was a very heated battle between literally the Black families and the white families, because Fubu, the name brand Fubu, had just been like deemed forbidden. Like nobody could wear FUBU in school because it was decided that it was gang related. And the Black families were like, excuse me, I'm sorry, what? And they were like, how can you say that this is gang related when literally all the white students are walking around with t-shirts with the Confederate flag on it that said things like the South will rise again, and you know what I mean? And so there was just this immediate friction. Like I immediately knew I was someplace that was very different from what I sort of knew, in the safety net of, you know, being in a melting pot where nobody questioned where you were. And now I'm in a place where how you identify who you are and who people understand you to be is incredibly important. So yeah, it's kind of crazy to like even think back on it now, because I'm just, you know, kind of learning more about myself and my history, even like in having to like explain that and relive that, because I'm just like, so much of the racial tension that I experienced and so much of that really, like, I'm like, no wonder, like, you know, I was like tight-lipped about, you know, like, yeah, I'm Black. And, you know, I don't want any problems. I don't want no trouble. I don't want no drama. Like, let's not even get into, I don't want to have to argue with people, you know. And I sort of grew up, you know, for the standardized test, when you have to mark your race and ethnicity on the standardized test, right? Like, you usually mark what your mom is, right? Like, that's kind of like how I grew up. So whatever your mother is, that's what you are. And I remember once I marked Spanish, I marked Hispanic on my standardized test, and my teacher literally handed it back to me and was like, no, you're not. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? I'm not what? You know, like I remember my mom being super upset because she's like, yes, you are. And like, even in like, whenever I would take Spanish in school, you know, they're like, you need to pick a Spanish name. Whole other TED talk on that. But, you know, in Spanish class, you pick your Spanish name, you know, it's Esmeralda, it's Ana, it's whatever, right? And I remember I went home and I told my mom, like, oh, I had to pick a Spanish name in class. And, you know, I don't even remember what name I picked. But she was like, excuse me, your Spanish name is Tiffany because I'm Spanish and that's what I named you, you know, like so like, it was like always this battle between like my mom and my family and the school system and, you know, Georgia at large, because it was like, you know.
I love Georgia at large.
Because it was like so much pushback all the time. And that was like sort of the beginning of my journey of having to explain who I am and why it is. Yeah. And it's just like, girl, I don't nobody got time to be having to go through all this every time. Like, but like the number of times my mom had to run up on the people at, you know, in middle school and high school was just like exhausting.
I'm going to tell a story about another standardized test called the 2010 census, where I was working for the 2010 census, obviously in 2010 in El Paso, and it was the first census where you could mark more than one race, and I was like one of the group leaders or whatever, and so we had group meetings where this woman was erasing all the Mexicans that had checked other and wrote Mexican. It was erasing those answers and putting in white like that. Like she couldn't deal with it. So she went and committed, I don't know if this is like, I don't know if I'm revealing a federal crime. I reported her, but like, I don't think anything happened. You know, like my supervisor was a white Mexican woman. And she didn't respond to like the graveness of this, right? Like, these are people self-reporting their identity, and yet you had this person like erasing it and just checking white for them. I want to go back a little to this like question of like of sort of wanting to keep the peace, or like wanting to keep quiet, like as a just like avoiding conflict, and introducing, for me, of the conflict that I've tried to avoid when speaking about race and Latinos and like the sort of space that I feel we're not allowed to inhabit openly. And by that, I mean talking about the racial disparities within Latino, Latinx representation. And yeah, of just all the times, I think about all the times I've given space to reaffirming white passing Latinx people of their Latino-ness. And it's just like a montage of why did I do that? And I wonder if anyone here has also had to do this and how that, if that policy is evolving, how much time do you have for that, et cetera.
I have no time. I don't know, like I'm at this point where like, yeah, I know, like I'm a person who presents as like Asian. I am an Asian woman, you know, and like that's something that I cannot edit out without looking like a fool. And so, yeah, I mean, like, but I can't really spend my time like going on and on about like, you know, something like erasure, because, and you know, like of my brownness, my Mexicanness, you know, like I can't do that because it's not happening to me. The erasure already happened. Like I'm living proof that whatever it was happened already, you know, and here we are. And I'm not being more racialized than a Black person. I'm not being more racialized anywhere I go as someone who is, you know, visibly othered, you know, someone who is Indigenous. Like I'm not, I think that for me lately, it is a question of time. And it's like, I just want to, knowing all that I know, you know, I just want to like uplift the people who are really, really being just erased over and over and over again and cannot afford and have never been able to edit at all. And yeah, I mean, yeah, like white Latinx people, like they take that time, you know, and I'm still reflecting on a lot of feelings around that, especially like over this past year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's like a refusal to naming it, right? Like of like anti-indigeneity, anti-Blackness, rooted in this like.
Oh my God, and there's such an envy too.
I think that's.
And no one wants to talk about that.
I think there's that. Because it's a view of like, of some sort of privilege that we occupy in some way, of being visibly.
Yeah, like people, there's this obsession with wanting to be oppressed. And I don't understand it. Like, it's not fun. So I find that like, you know, when you have people who are passing that are so desperately like seeking the approval from people who aren't passing, it's like to the point where like you're creating situations and stories and stuff that people actually like, those are actually lived experience for some people. And I have a hard time feeling bad for you when you don't actually experience those things, but you want me to like validate your existence as a person of color. Like you have to know and recognize the privilege of the space that you take up and your ability to pick and choose when you want to be an other and when it's convenient for you to be an other and when it's convenient for you to pass. And like, we don't have that option. I don't have that option. So it's really hard for me to empathize with people who have this sort of like obsession with wanting to seem like they're oppressed. I don't know. It's weird. It's like a weird flex. Like, what are you doing?
So weird.
It's a weird
so
flex.
Weird.
It's really, really weird.
I think this is a great segue into our visual aid for the day. Erin, can you bring up visual aid number 1, please. Because this obsession extends beyond life. So for those of us, for those people that don't know, right? The person, this is Walter Mercado, the astro, el astro. What was his name? Like what did they? Astro de las estrellas. And Walter Mercado, who is like that is him. And in this sort of digital afterlife, somebody wanted to mark him as brown, I guess. And astrologo, thank you. I could only think of astro. And I just want to bring this to the table of what in Latinidad's name happened here.
Ooh, child. This is just.
I mean, like, you got the full Ariana Grande, like.
Woo! There it is.
Also, again, this is not him. This is not his investment.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
It's just a fan. Just a fan.
It's just a fan.
Oh, picking and choosing.
I just have so many questions, like, but my biggest one is why? 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 What is this doing for him? What is this doing for his legacy? What is this doing for any of us, honestly?
Besides confusing people.
So this is from the documentary, the Netflix documentary. And I think it happens, it shows up shortly after he says that he wants to be played in the movie about his life. He wants to be played by Timothée Chalamet, which, you know, it also dishonors his last wishes. But there's this like sort of investment in making sure that people know that he's brown when I'm very confused. So I was genuinely asking of like, if somebody could explain it to me. And I think we've come up with no answers. There's this way in which I feel this is more of a line, but Latinx, Latinidad, whatever we're sort of struggling to name here, like this industrial entertainment complex.
Yes.
I feel like we pretend that like only pan dulce and la loteria cross borders, but not anti-indigeneity, not anti-Blackness. Like that ingrained culture somehow like respects borders. It stays behind, and only these like bite-sized cultural folkloric artifacts make it through, right? And like we don't actually want to deal with the history, very complicated history of Latin America and of like Latin America's relationship to the US, right?
Yes.
Like, because it's like it is such a historical, I don't know, clusterfuck. I don't know.
There's
how else
so
to
much
say
enmeshment.
it.
There's so much enmeshment. Like you cannot talk about one without the other. Just the effects of like imperialism, like immigration, you know, the impact on like migration patterns, like throughout, you know, the South America and Central America. Like the two go hand in hand. And like just like looking at like this photo, you know, like I was thinking about that article that you sent to me just about the myth of the mestizo, and like and you know, and thinking about, you know, Mexico like holding up like Mestizaje like as this like cosmic race, and then, you know, and then sort of having this experience here in the US where like a lot of, you know, biracial like mixed like children are pointed to and, you know, advertised and like consumed like, yeah, as this like, you know, savior race, that if we all like just like race mix, like, you know, things will be better. And like I've always like I see images like this and I'm always like brought back to that, like that notion, that falsehood, you know, like the cosmic race, like there was an attempt at that. It's called Mexico. It doesn't fucking work.
Yeah, Mexico believes that that racism is not a problem, that it is not a racist country.
Oh, they solved it.
They, because of this like this myth of Mestizaje. One other thing, like just a random thing that I keep thinking about in terms of like when Mexico was being colonized and mined for silver, it was a global enterprise where the silver that's being mined in Mexico doesn't end up in Europe. It actually ends up in China. And there is like an entire like trade that is like global and in a much more complicated way than we want to think about or are ready to think about. And I feel we want to flatten those stories by just, I don't know, I don't know where to have these conversations, if that makes sense, except for here.
It feels to me that it goes back to this questionnaire of the binary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, even in some of the comments, it's like, oh, we want to claim them as ours and not theirs. And so it becomes this binary again, which is inherently always more complicated. The world has never been binary. Mm-hmm. So at the same time that the silver is going to China, there's also incredible repression against Chinese folks in Mexico, who in some cases end up getting kicked out and sent back to China. And in some cases, taking with them their Yaqui wives and entire tribes existing in China of the Yaqui, you know? So it's like our histories, our migrations, forced and chosen, are inherently more complicated than the stories that we're allowed to tell. And I think that the point that you had brought up at one point, Victor, around divisiveness, and I think that what has been true for me is anytime anybody says that they're fighting against white supremacy, or we're going to call out white supremacy, or, you know, anytime that becomes the topic, if I disagree with any of strategy, tactics, demands, I feel like I shouldn't say a word, because that becomes divisive. If we're fighting against white supremacy, we're all on board to fight against white supremacy, right? And then part of the thing that I've realized is that within the theater world specifically, and I think that COVID has highlighted this for me in a different kind of way, within the theater world, one of the things that we're not talking about is we're not talking about exploitation of labor in the ways in which the arts world in general is set up, but specifically theater. And so that you have a large amount of money that goes to a small number of institutions, and then that we all start to have this fight over monies, and we're starting to have a technocratic response to race, where we're creating this whole other industry of anti-racism to teach white people how to be better white people, while artists are still largely unemployed, you know? And so it's crazy to me that in the last month, I have seen four calls for EDI specialists in major theaters at 6 figures, right? 4 calls for 6 figures of EDI specialists at these major institutions at a moment in we're experiencing one of the biggest unemployment that we've had in this industry, where artists don't have work, you know? And so that we remain kind of structured on this way of working in which our industry is dependent on a freelance pool of artists who, and the people that have health insurance, the people that have stability, the people that become administrative. And so then what becomes the imbalance of power in those types of relationships? And so the ways that I feel like the ways that we're talking about race increasingly have become technocratic. And that's something that's disturbing for me, and doesn't allow, so that when I decide to be quiet, because, you know, I don't want to show my shit in front of other folks, when I decide to be quiet, like those are the moments when I start to realize, like, oh, these are places that I don't feel any more safe. I don't feel any more seen. I don't feel any more, you know? And so kind of like getting to that place of talking about, well, what is that? Well, what is causing that? means that we also have to talk about class and gender and race.
Yes.
And we also have to talk about race as Latinos, which is what Latinos don't want to do because the US doesn't do it. You know, it's like, so it's like all these things are, I think, really linked in these very complicated ways, and the ways that we're allowed to talk about them, I think, become very simplified. And so when you ask what we have time for, we don't have time for, I don't have time for teaching, reteaching, teaching, uneducating, all of those types of things. I'm less interested in the comments. I'm more interested in the undercomments. And I'm really interested in how we create those networks for each other, where we don't have to exist in a place of explaining ourselves or defending ourselves or justifying our existence, because we just are. It wasn't until graduate school that I knew that white people made theater. Like, I had no understanding of that from where I grew up. Like, I went to graduate school and I was like, what are all these men doing here? What are all these white people doing here? Because I had grown up in a space that was Black and brown, and we were the ones making theater. And so it's like, that's the shift that I want to have in the conversation. The conversations around race are not new. We've been having them since, you know, before. And it's like, how do we begin to have a conversation that gets us to reach across the lines, the false lines, the made up lines that have been drawn up with colonialism, with capitalism, with colonization? How do we move beyond those lines to see each other? And I definitely don't want to have a conversation with white American theater or with white Latinos about, now I'm like this, but it's just like, I just feel like, I feel like increasingly what I do is I hermit. So my response is like, just hermit and do the work, just hermit and do the work, just hermit and do the work, and I don't know if that's the best strategy or not, but it's definitely the strategy that I've taken to as of late.
Yeah, same. I also like hermit, and like, especially considering like my position and like where I am, like in terms of like, the hierarchy within institutions and stuff. Most often I'm an apprentice or the only person of color or the youngest most often. And so it's always hard to like have those conversations and talk to people and be like, hey, I heard you say that thing, you shouldn't say that, and then like have to explain why, and then be gaslit or be called threatening, or like, well, you weren't smiling when I said that, and so you must be mad at me. Are you mad at me? And it's like, it's exhausting. Yeah.
The answer usually for me is yes, I am mad.
Exhausting having to be the one representative in the room, because then like everybody like turns and looks at you like, what did you think? Like, as if you are the speaker for the race, or the speaker for all brown people, the speaker for all Black and brown people. It's exhausting. Like, I don't want that type of responsibility.
And I guess one of my questions is there a way that we can divest from that? Like, can we divest from that way? Like, why do we keep giving people our labor? Why do we keep giving people our animo, our spirit? Like, can we divest from that? And again, I don't totally know the answer to that. But even in like for this talk, one of the things that I pulled up again was Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism, where she says racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And I think that I'm also feeling a little bit like on edge and angry, and I'm starting to embrace female rage more and more. But coming off of this week of being in Texas, where people chose to let a system break down because the people that it would affect adversely, they don't care about. Given that we just got these reports about Joe Biden and his decisions that he's making about immigration, which everybody was screaming that Obama started the cages, and he picked up all of everybody from Obama's administration and put them into, making, again, decisions that don't care about those people that are still sitting in cages, that are now expanding, and that he's now deporting in record numbers, even to Trump. It's like, there are these things that just make me so like I am on edge. And so this thing about what we have time for, we don't have time for. I don't have time for your newly discovered grandmother from a trunk, you know, generations ago. I don't care. I don't care.
Come on, Virginia. We don't have time.
I don't care. I want to know what are the spaces that we are creating that is directly leading to the liberation of our people. That's what I want to care. That's what I care about.
And that's
yes,
it.
yes.
And those people aren't defined in a box.
Yeah. Thank you. We promised questions, but I think we're exhausted, right? I just think that's like such a wonderful call to action, and I feel energized. How do you guys feel? Is this do we have time for one or two questions, or are we exhausted?
I would say questions.
Yeah.
2 questions?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm old. I'm exhausted.
If you have any questions, I think we have time for one or two questions. So like, just like drop one in the chat if you have them. And if not, we just have time to find a Mexican grandmother in our trunk or grandfather.
Ciao.
In a little valise. Oh, somebody found one in a closet. So
thank goodness.
I encourage us all to come out of the closet.
Not safe in there.
Oh, this has been such a marvelous chat. I'm so glad we're getting together to have this conversation. I hope this is like the first in a series of conversations. I'm hungry to have these conversations with people, and like I feel like we did the initial work so that the next time we meet here or elsewhere, we can just continue where we left off. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. I feel like I'm coming in to crash the party. Gracias. Thank you so very much for all your stories and for having this really important conversation. And thank you all of you that joined us today for the conversation. We have a number of other programs in the coming days. We have a virtual open mic on Thursday called One Song Glory, celebrating the legacy of Rent. And of course, we have our gala on March 2nd, celebrating the 25 years of Rent. So make sure you get a ticket on our website and join us. It promises to be a fantastic event. And then this Friday, on March 26th, I should say, we have a masterclass on experiments on digital theater. And at the end, as I said at the very beginning, you'll see a slide with links if you want to do a donation for Olgo and all the great work that they're doing in Texas and beyond, supporting queer people of color. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Virginia, Tiffany, Andrew, and Lindsay. And thank you all of you for joining us.
I just want to say real quick that Algo is also part of an umbrella organization that has been doing a lot of mutual aid here, which is one of the reasons why they were suggested as a place to donate to, because there are still people without water or boiling water. My parents didn't have electricity for a week. And so, you know, if people want to donate to mutual aid at first, Algo is a really great place to donate.
Thank you. And we'll continue this talk at the bar down the street. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.